I didn't realize what the lineup was going to be tonight when I was invited to do this, and I have a fantastic story to tell that brings together the wonderful Yotam Ottolenghi and a muffin he made, and the wonderful Andy O'Hagan and life as seen from the dog's point of view. And the dog in question is Carmen Khalil's dog Louis, but that'll have to be for another time. I'm actually here to talk about this woman. She's photographed in July 1935 in a lunatic asylum. I found the photograph in her so-called medical file, which, if you know anything about lunatic asylums, is rarely worthy of being described as such. She's called the Honourable Violet Gibson, and at this time she's been in the loony bin for 10 years. She's got 20 more years to go, confined against her will in Northampton General Hospital for Mental Diseases, as it was then known. And there she will die, long, long after her story has been forgotten. She's feeding birds, and I want you to focus on her extended arm, which I'll come back to. I think she's consciously evoking a pose of St. Francis of Assisi. She had a bit of a thing about him, and indeed she had a bit of a thing about God too, and we'll come back to that as well. It plays, God and the saints play a large part in her story. But for now, as I say, it's her position and the raised arm that I'm particularly interested in. We go back almost 10 years to April the 7th, 1926, 11 a.m. in the morning, and Violet is standing next to a lamppost on Rome's Piazza Campidoglio, just outside the building on the right as you go up the stairs, for those of you who know it, which is the Palazzo dei Conservatori. There's a huge crowd surging around her. Every now and then a straggler pops out, like a hernia is pushed back in by the police, and they're all waiting. There's a mood of great expectation. Violet is holding her right hand in her pocket and gripping a 5mm revolver loaded with 6 bullets. And the man she's waiting for is this man. Now, I have to say, it's a bit naughty to use this photograph because he's not actually in the habit of going around Rome half naked. But I chose it for a reason, which is that in 1926, very early on into Mussolini's career as Prime Minister of Italy, Il Duce, he'd already attracted worldwide great admirers. Photographs like this were circulated in their millions at the time. Women in particular found him irresistible, his glistening, vibrating torso. And we know that Lady Asquith, wife of our Prime Minister, Lady Oxford, Lady Up Yours, Lady Down Yours, they all quivered with excitement upon meeting Mussolini. All those Miss Jean Brodie's, women in their prime, they too longed to have tea with Mussolini. Not so Violet Gibson. Can we have the next slide, please? Mussolini can't be seen here, nor can Violet. She's vaguely where that circle is drawn up, but he's just about to emerge. This is the only photograph, known photograph, taken on that morning, April the 7th, 1926. He's just following the guy there who's marching out between the columns, and he'll land up a couple of feet away from Violet Gibson. He turns to salute the crowd, which roars and cheers and moves, and there's a great swell of excitement. And the fascist anthem, Giovinezza, goes up. Violet pushes forward from her position next to the lamppost, raises her arm, just as we saw her in that photograph, but this time she has a pistol in it. She's only a foot or so away, and she fires, just as Mussolini turns to look at her in astonishment. She misses, or rather the bullet grazes the bridge of his nose and takes a small divot of flesh out, but his hand clamps to his face and there's blood pouring through between his fingers. He staggers back a couple of steps, but he's still on his feet, and Violet, to her absolute astonishment, sees that she hasn't killed him, and Mussolini, to his astonishment, realizes that he's not dead. And there's a little pause before she pulls the trigger again. And this time there's a click, a misfire. The bullet has lodged, as it turns out, in the chamber of the gun. Mussolini, to his credit, I suppose, has the composure to address the crowd, and he says from behind his hand, "This is nothing, it's a mere trifle. Everybody stay calm. Nobody panic." So everybody panics. And what follows is I hate to fall to national stereotypes, but quite a classic Italian brawl. The woman standing behind Violet sets about her by yanking her hair and bashing her around the head with a handbag. A policeman nearby manages to knock the pistol from her hand and then delivers a punch square to Violet's face, and she goes straight down onto the ground. And then things turn really ugly. The crowd leap in and they kick and tear and pull at her and yank at her hair. A policeman tries to extract her from the crowd, and he's knocked out and has to be taken later to hospital. Anyway, eventually, the police and plainclothes agents who were there do manage to grab her before she's killed, and they drag her off to a nearby courtyard where, and this is another stereotype, but it's a nice touch, I think, because she's so nervous, somebody sends for a cognac to the local bar to steady her nerves. But she's obviously in deep shock at this point and can't say anything other than stammering out her name. Mussolini, meanwhile, has been whisked back into the building so that his wound can be attended to. He's just addressed an international conference of surgeons, and there are about 160 on hand to deal with this wound. In fact, he later confesses to his wife that he thought this was the moment he was actually going to die, because they put him on a chair with his feet higher than his head, or higher than his heart, to stem the flow of blood, and they were all crushing into this tiny room trying to save his life. Anyway, he emerged, as Violet had been taken off, he emerged again and was bundled into a car. He addressed the crowd again and was taken back to his apartment, where he finally allowed himself to be very shocked, and where he was greeted and comforted by his Jewish mistress, Margherita Sarfatti. The square was cleared by the police and roped off as a crime scene, and Violet was taken about an hour after she'd shot Mussolini. She was taken in a police car to the nearby Mantelate jail, which is just on the other side of the Tiber from Piazza del Campidoglio. And there, if I can have the next slide, she was photographed, and the shots, actually close up, you can see much more clearly, but the incipient wounds and swellings on her face from where she'd been punched, and cuts, and her clothes slightly sort of torn. She's only 50, she looks a lot older, and all eyewitness accounts describe a woman of great age. She's not in very good physical condition, but her eyes stare out as if from a porthole, I feel, at the great mystery of the world beyond, and she's fingerprinted here. She was then taken by the nuns who ran at that time the women's section of the Mantelate prison to be strip searched. They were astonished to find absolutely nothing on her. She had no possessions at all. The only thing she had in her pocket was a tiny little scrap of an envelope, the tip of a lip of an envelope, on which she'd written Palazzo del Littorio. And it appears that her original chosen site for assassinating Mussolini had been at the headquarters of the fascist party, which was that address, and it's as if she had stumbled across Campidoglio without realizing that he was going to be there, and once she realized that he had, she'd taken up position. It was an opportunity too good to be missed. But she did miss, we now know. Can I have the next slide? This is Mussolini, the next day. I don't know why I confused the two. Cheerily smiling for the cameras. You can't actually see it in this particular photograph, but his eyes were very bloodshot from the powder burn from the point-blank shot. He continues with his schedule. The next day he's off to Libya, Scipio sailing to his North African sandpit. Violet, meanwhile, is in her prison cell, finally beginning to talk to investigators. She says very little, but she does say that it was God who sent her on her mission and who also provided her with saints to steady her aim. At the same time, the Pope is celebrating Mussolini's miraculous survival and claiming that it was God who intervened to save his life. So we're dealing in this story with a very strange God, because he tells Violet on the one hand to kill Mussolini and instructs the bullets on the other hand not to reach him. And as I say, we will come back to God. But for the moment, there are very few people other than Violet who regret having missed him. This is a time when Mussolini basked in international approval. Everybody except for the communists thought he was fantastic, wonderful, accorded him certificates of merit, especially the British. The British establishment were very attached to Mussolini and the idea of the stable Italy that he could provide. Indeed, his first visit as international or foreign visit as premier had been to London in 1923, where he was decorated with the Order of the Bath, whatever that is, laid a wreath at the cenotaph, and missed a press conference because he was in bed with a prostitute at Claridge's. As I say, very few people regretted that Violet had missed beyond herself, and there was much scraping of ambassadorial knees and deep embarrassment on the behalf of the British that it turned out that this was a British subject. There was a lot of confusion at the beginning as to who she was, because, as I say, she couldn't speak. Amongst those who were very annoyed by the attempt was a young schoolgirl, 14-year-old, who wrote the next day to Mussolini that she wanted to be allowed to strangle the woman who tried to kill him, and that she was ready as an ardent fascist of the first hour to give up her life for him. Her name was Clara Petacci, and all I can say is be careful what you wish for. Mussolini was very embarrassed in particular that he'd been shot by a woman, and a foreign woman at that. And when it transpired that she was the daughter of the former Lord Chancellor of Ireland, Lord Ashbourne, famous for the Ashbourne Land Acts, that she was a woman of private means, from a very privileged background, had been presented at court, I think we've got a slide of this, at the court of Queen Victoria as a debutante. There was really great consternation in diplomatic circles, both in Rome and in London. On learning of her Irish connection, Mussolini said that he was of the opinion that she was definitely, therefore, stark, staring mad, I quote, and should be returned to Ireland, where she would find much congenial company amongst the inhabitants. The notion that Violet was mad has, I think, been the reason that she's just been written out of history. If you read any biography of Mussolini or of fascism, you'll find barely a mention of her, and where you do, she's dismissed in one line as a half-mad mystic, an Irish eccentric, half-nutty, bonkers, spinster this, spinster that. I mean, all feminists and people who care about the language of psychiatric health should be warned that it's never very complimentary. It's my view that she might have been a bit mad. She certainly was eccentric. And she might not have been. She might have been faking madness. Indeed, very early on in the investigation, a man came forward who seemed to know quite a lot about her family and background to police, and said that he believed that she was faking a sort of, I think he called it an ancient Irish stratagem, faking a verbal dysfunction in order to confuse people, kind of that, you see, officer, I wasn't there, but if I was asleep, that kind of stuff. But she was no village Egypt, I have to say, and if she had learned the art of dissimulation, she probably had acquired something of this through Victorian parlour games with her many siblings. She came from a very big family. But she did reveal from prison in a letter to her friend that she took great enjoyment at drawing red herrings across everybody's path, and it was certainly the belief of the lead investigator on her case, who doggedly pursued this line of inquiry, that she had tried to fake madness in order to cover up what was in fact a politically motivated crime in which she was a conspirator, and that her accomplices had simply melted away after the fact. But as I say, Mussolini wanted her mad, and it suited him and the regime, and certainly the British, to have her that way, mad rather than bad. I think the logic for Mussolini was that no sane person could possibly want to kill him, although that sat at an impossible angle to the reality of the assassination attempts that had preceded hers, and there were several after. In fact, there were 4 in a 12-month period, of which hers was one. Ironically, and tragically in a sense for Violet, Mussolini very cynically exploited all of these attempts to create the justification for passing a very repressive set of laws, legislation really that paved the way for the establishment of the totalitarian state. In fact, it was Europe's first totalitarian state, and it was Mussolini who gave the word. It was his 6-syllabled gift to the 20th century. So indirectly and sadly, Violet and the other assassins, or would-be assassins of that year, actually helped to galvanize, to harden and quicken the regime, a regime that in the end was responsible for the deaths of up to 1 million people, if you include those who were taken into war unnecessarily by Mussolini. Not to mention the people he bombed with arsine gas and other chemicals in pursuit of his colonial claims. Violet, I believe, did have a motive, and it's one that she guarded very, very closely. She was a convert to Catholicism, and she had joined the modernist wing, a movement that was sort of started in Oxford and that was committed to challenging the Pope's authority, and in particular openly accused him of embarking on an odious compromise with fascism. Can we have number 8, actually? There's her in a sort of mystic pose. She did have a bit of a God thing, and this was used as evidence that she was mad and hysterical. But I want to move straight on to the next slide, which shows what mad people really looked like then. This is a photograph of one of Jean-Martin Charcot's patients for the famous sets of photographs that he established as head of the Salpêtrière hospital in Paris. These patients he classified according to different traces or imprints that he felt that the nervous diseases left on their bodies. And I just want you to have a look at this woman's facial expressions. This is absolutely classically, even in the 1920s, these photographs were widely circulated. Classically, the sort of iconography of madness. If we could go to the next slide, you'll see that I'm, well, I think it's enough. Mussolini's eyes rolling like dangerous gooseberries sort of makes the point for me. And if I can go straight to the next slide, we're still on madness, and this photograph of Violet used as graphic evidence by the Daily Mail of her derangement. The photograph is actually taken from a passport photograph, so all I can say is, do not show your passport photographs to the Daily Mail, or indeed to psychiatrists. I know that my British Library Reader's Pass makes me look legally moronic. So I feel this is very unfair, and the point I'm trying to make here is that I don't think that sanity is in one place and insanity in another. If Violet is mad, it's possible that Mussolini might have been. Neither are destinations that you arrive at just by hurrying on to the last bus. However, Violet's punishment for the crime was to spend 30 years in a lunatic asylum. Can we go to the next slide? She was smuggled out of Italy on a train, and she ended up in St Andrews, where Lucia Joyce also was sent, much later than Violet. Their paths did cross. I'm showing this photograph because I'm very grateful to Helen McTaggart, who's here tonight, who took it in 1977. It's the only photograph of Lucia Joyce in the asylum. She too was there for 30 years, a silenced witness to her fate, a self-consumer of her woes, as John Clare would have put it. If I can go to the last slide, because I know that time's running short. This man, and someone once said to me, "Oh, what's your book called? The Woman Who Shot the Woman Who Dropped My Salami." And I don't want to make a joke at his expense, but I suppose I will actually. But there's something horribly like the butcher's rack, isn't there? Or the the 2 prosciuttos here. This is Clara, who had said she would give up her life for him, and she did. And this is Mussolini after they had been pretty seriously disfigured by the crowd. Same crowd that had jumped onto Violet and tried to lynch her. In 1945, they spat on and urinated on and shot at and kicked and punched Mussolini's body in particular. That was their ending. The people who tried to assassinate them, who were still alive, but in prison on the islands where political prisoners were held in captivity for years and years and years, were all released. Not so Violet Gibson. It got to the point where a junior doctor who was keeping notes on her, said that she was clearly delusional because she claimed that she'd once shot Mussolini. She died in 1956, If I have the last slide, please. This is her gravestone, Violet Gibson, comma. Very unusual to find this kind of punctuation on a gravestone. There's usually no comma and no full stop, and there is. 20 feet away is Lucia Joyce. She's also buried in this dreary flatland of a cemetery in Northampton. Buses thundering past, rattling my bones, and I imagine everybody else's underneath. And I guess, really, my feeling is that the Honourable Violet Gibson deserved better than that. And then the comma and the full stop between those two little punctuation marks lies the most extraordinary story. And I hope that in some way I've retrieved it for you tonight. Thanks very much.